on the floor may switch on their video cameras while they're presenting. And when you have questions or comments or clarity, we'll just ask you to use the chat function. So if you post your comments or your question on the chat function, we will note you and be sure to relay your questions or comments to the panelists. Please try by all means to not distract the speakers with unmuted mics, interruptions during presentations. We're very pleased that you are here, and please also note that this particular discussion will be recorded for distribution in our networks as well as is in our social media. So whatever you say here is on the record. There's no two ways around it. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. For our launch. And without further ado, I would like to call our Executive Director, Joe Nechitenze, who's Executive Director here at the Mapungubwe Institute, whose role is simply to welcome us to his house and to tell us the vision for this particular publication. Thank you very much, Joel.
Thank you, Annelile, and welcome to all the colleagues. It's a proud moment today that we are launching this book on arts and culture, particularly as it is a project that has been long in gestation. There was much toing and froing as the project evolved, and it started to look like we would not reach this milestone. Of course, the theme does not lend itself to easy treatment because arts and culture speak to the very being of a people. They straddle the meanings of history, culture, cultural existence and future trajectories. As a result, discourse on the arts and national development cannot but cover a very broad canvas upon which the political economy plays itself. The arts take from real life and give back to it in many generous ways. Artistic expression cannot be captured, chained, and rendered an instrument of any one cause, however noble. It is in the nature of humanity that we constantly seek to interpret our being in both direct and indirect ways. And this can take a life of its own, unchained from material existence. But in time, artistic expression voluntarily flies back into the coop of lived experience in an endless virtuous cycle. South Africa's cultural life and artistic expression evolved historically as people of this nation state intermingled, subjugated, and fought against one another, and ultimately fashioned today's political settlement. The authors of this volume, appropriately titled Mintirho, Vulavula, or Actions Speak for Themselves, seek to describe the omnipresence of the arts. They reflect on past and present value judgments and on the gray areas in between. They also present the technicolor of struggle narratives, the tortuous birth of our nation, as well as intergenerational fusions and fissions in a post-colonial society. Now, contained in the various chapters of this book are reflections on the issues of whether an overarching identity is possible in the midst of diversity. This is covered in an array of treatments of lived experience using different genres, to interpret the ongoing struggle to create a new nation. Artificial rainbowism, which eschews tension and contradiction, is critiqued, and intergenerational contestations are explored. Using music, publishing, theater, painting, opera, and other forms as frames of reference, the authors seem, by quirk of fate, to converge towards a question that is posed in one of the chapters. Has the history of South African society not rendered ours a mad country, quote unquote, suffering from a multitude of unresolved collective and individual pathologies? But who constitutes this nation? One of the authors dares to ask, and in this context, the issue of belonging and livability arises in the context of a society and spaces that are continually defined by internal and cross-border migration. Compiling a volume of this kind is an act of some bravery, I think, and the editors and authors should be congratulated. If the content may appear eclectic, this should have been expected, but there is a golden thread, and this is that there is a strategic role for the arts in national development. This requires an appropriate policy framework which straddles social, psychological, educational, entertainment, informational, and other meanings. And such policy should be developed in consultation with art theoretician, practitioner, enthusiast, and critic alike. It also requires an appreciation of the changing environment brought about by the infusion of new technologies, a reality reflected in the nascent fourth industrial revolution, which has been further underlined by the experience in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so the Mapungubwe Institute is profoundly grateful to the authors and all the partners who have given us this unique product. We hope that their assertions and indeed their provocations will generate deeper reflections on the role of the arts and culture in a transforming society. Our thanks also go to the donors and the broader MISTRA family. You are all welcome. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you very much, ED, for that brief welcoming remark in preface of the book. It's very important for us to always know the aims of the project and what we seek to get out of it. Which brings me to highlighting the fact that in the Mapungubwe Institute, after we do the particular research, we produce a policy brief. And with this policy brief, it will be shared in the chat. It's basically some of the key insights that have come across throughout all of the chapters that then now instruct policymakers to act. Just like the title of the book says, actions speak for themselves. Thank you very much, Joel. If you look at the cover of our book, we'll ask someone to share it for us. We just would like to acknowledge at this particular point, Breeze Yoko, who actually did this particular mural for us that made this outstanding cover. It's absolutely beautiful. And we will be sharing it we will be sharing the cover quite soon. Thank you very much, Breeze Yogo. It's absolutely outstanding. And we do hope that having it on the cover of this particular publication will honor you and will do your work justice. Thank you very much. I would now like to call Prof. Innocentia Jabsile Mhlambi, who is the co-editor of this particular edited volume. Prof. Mhlambi is I'm getting, a star, what is it called? Yes, I am absolutely in love with Prof. Mhlambi for her work. She's currently the associate professor and the head of the Department of African Languages at WITS. She teaches African language literature, Black film studies, popular culture, oral literature, and visual culture. She is the author of the African language literatures, perspectives on isiZulu fiction and popular Black television series, both in broadcast and print media in South Africa. She was selected as a participant in the University of Michigan Presidential Scholars Program and is currently doing research on Black opera in post-1994 South Africa. Prof. Mhlambi also in this particular volume wrote a chapter called Case Studies of Localized South African Cultural Productions from Below, Nation Formation and Social Cohesion. We are indeed amongst greatness, and with that, we would like to welcome you, Prof. Mhlambi, to give us the overview of this particular publication and how you guys executed it. Thanks, Prof.
Thank you so much, Anelile. And I have my lecture or my paper submitted. Probably it's going to be shared on chat or upon request from organizers. And I begin my introduction with some extract from the introduction itself. And then I quickly move on to what are the aims, the scope of the book, because I wanted to shine a spotlight on the scope, and then end by sort of giving an overview of how the book is sort of constituted. In a country with a development path and democratic transition shaped by a history of colonial occupation and repression, the epistemology and praxis of art, culture, and heritage are rendered all the more significant to development endeavors. Indeed, we cannot contextualize the calls for social transformation in South Africa within a broader global movement for the recognition and restoration of indigenous heritage and knowledge production, and in recent campaigns for decolonization and racial justice. The resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement in May 2020, stemming from the death of African Americans, George Floyd and Breonna Taylor at the hands of white American police officers, once again foregrounded the marked persistence of racial and institutional injustice in societies with long histories of anti-racial struggles and national policy shifts. Elsewhere in the world, national cultures such as the one advocated for by our own country, the rainbow nationalisms, are actually rejected. Currently, the Maori people in Aotearoa are still outraged that a national culture forces them to celebrate a colonial legacy that visited horror and tyranny on the Maori people. The advent of non-racial democracy in the United States predated the South African experience by several decades. Yet towards the end of 2015, students at South Africa's public universities started a movement to campaign not only for free education at tertiary level, but also for the decolonization of teaching and learning and the social transformation of white-controlled institutions. As in the case of Black Lives Matter, the protest of the Fees Must Fall movement targeted citadels and symbols of white domination and supremacy, the historical monuments of founding figures of these racialized societies. Their focus on monumentalized objects of history brings into sharp focus the role that art, culture, and heritage play in the making and unmaking of societies and nations. The targeting of these monuments touches on three aspects that are central to cultural production. First, the figures are in themselves work of art. Second, they are commissioned to celebrate a culture of a society or nation, in this case, a culture of racism. And third, they are monumentalized as commemorative objects of history, meaning that they represent a heritage that binds a nation. But whose national arts, culture, and heritage are they? If different sectors of the nation find them objectionable during moments of heightened intolerance of cultural and racial diversity, if the arts, culture, and heritage commodities of any nation emerge from history steeped in what Abdul Jan Muhammad termed colonial Manichaean binaries, should it not be obvious that such cultural objects will inevitably be rejected by those citizens most derided by the installation and their celebration? South Africa can draw lessons from the recent racial explosions in the global north. Despite years of anti-racism struggle, particularly in the United States, the promises entailed in their cultural policies of healing and national transformation have been dealt a resounding blow. Arts, culture, and heritage are thus at the center of these recent protests and elaborations of the contested conventions of the politics of historiography. While these recent events provide important context for the questions addressed in this book, the pressing concern is how existing discourses and practices can draw lessons from how indigenous societies, suppressed and subjected to the colonial order of things, process these cultural categories for redress and social transformation. Writings about indigenous societies and the deployment of arts, culture, and heritage production for social transformation and healing have shown that there is a need for a sense of a shared culture that will be a crucible for social formulation and collective imagination. In other words, this shared culture must lead to some level of social cohesion and therefore a process of nation building. Against this background, this book contributes to a way forward for social transformation and cohesion that positions arts, culture, and heritage as key contributors to effective policy formulation. In an effort to position the sector at the center of the project of democratization and development, it draws together contributions from the visual, literary, performing, and multidisciplinary arts and locates them in the context of a wider social debates that call for the transformation of centers of power. The critical appraisals of the authors are diverse and cover views across generations, providing a rich constellation of ideas that blend practice-sourced observation, some of the best heritage practices in South Africa. Throughout the volume, readers are invited to consider the Arts and Culture White Paper of 1996 as the post-apartheid regime's attempt at the transformation of arts and culture. Our aims or the aim of the collection is considered within a longer historical kind of a framework within the 3 decades of almost the 3 decades of post-colonial or post-apartheid existence. And therefore, it's urgent to review public policies and public discourse on the role of arts, culture, and heritage in South Africa. The book aims to reposition the value of arts in South Africa's democratic transition and arts and culture's long-term strategic fit in society, especially in facilitating social transformation, nation building, and social cohesion. And in terms of the scope, the book provides important insight into the ways in which the arts can both guide and challenge dominant notion of development, identity, and democracy, and possibilities they hold for new beginnings. This book demonstrates that cultural output is not the product of an automatic process resulting from artists exercising their freedom of expression as enshrined in the country's constitution. It shows that the production of art involves a number of issues. The sociology of culture as espoused by Bourdieu and others, which affect cultural policies, analysis of cultural consumption, conditions of cultural production, structural relations of power, and changes of economic and cultural capital. According to Bourdieu's conceptualization, cultural reproduction is a social process of producing culture across generations a process made possible by major institutions found in society such as schools, media, universities, and government departments. These are institutions more often than not transmit ideas that privilege the cultural position of the dominant classes. In an essay titled Forms of Capital, Bourdieu identifies three forms of cultural capital, namely embodied capital, institutionalized capital, and objectified capital. While institutionalized capital can be something certified, such as the degrees and jobs we possess, objectified capital reflects the material things we possess, such as the brand we choose, and is often a determinant of our economic conditions in society. These conditions help some people to maintain their privileged positions and pass them on to their kin and kin, aspects which have potential to reproduce and maintain social inequalities. On the other hand, embodied capital is acquired over time through socialization and education. It is reflected in our mannerisms and the skills we acquire, which together shape our behavior. These forms are used to describe and understand how culture is passed from one generation to another. Contributions to this book, highlight policy positions taken by the state to bestow cultural, economic, or symbolic capital on certain cultural productions. We recognize that Bourdieu's broader concept on cultural production had been devised as a rejoinder to 19th century modern art productions within democratic context of the West. However, we argue that his ideas are epistemologically open and can be appropriated to study South African cultural policy, which also has at its basis Western notions of nationalism and creation of national identities. The post-1994 attempts at reconfiguring cultural production present opportunities to understand how cultural processes of the colonial apartheid past were formulated, how to prevent this from self-generation in a Gramscian sense, and how to transform them for the benefit of South Africa's development. As Bourdieu's tenets demonstrate, cultural production structures of social relations and position taking in the field of cultural production are foundational to creating new possibilities for art forms to achieve symbolic capital. Yet this is dependent on how cultural forms are positioned and on their interrelations with the institutions that determine the distribution of resources and capital. Such cultural entities are, of course, contested terrains, and the social structures mandated with cultural productions are complex, fractured, and susceptible to changes wrought by the global structures that influence them. This is particularly the case in a post-colony such as South Africa, where local and international capital interest, capitalist logic, and the commercial linkages established through settler communities continue to exert formidable power on the shape and development of the post-apartheid nation state. In the South African context or case, the ANC-led government serves as the newcomer to dismantle the entrenched structural relations and sedimented conditions of cultural productions of the past. This involves wresting away power from organizations that guided the cultural policy of the past epochs and redirecting it to new South African cultural policies. Bourdieu's view of cultural fields of production helps us to understand the factors that restrict and allow for this transformation, to think of what is doable or not and what is possible or not, depending on how social institutions operating within the cultural fields are constituted. All chapters in this volume intones Bourdieu's The Rule of Art, and they draw attention to the structured nature of making symbolic goods and the way that the social making up of the rules surrounding such activities is hidden from view or misrecognized. And of course, we had a series of theoretical and practice-based kinds of questions that we raised. I have extensive list of them in the presentation that is going to be shared with you, but I can actually go through a few, like how do we define arts, because that was fundamental. How do we define arts, culture, and heritage in a society with a complex history of hegemonic and counter-hegemonic tradition? How historical positions on arts, culture, and heritage can be reconciled with post-apartheid cultural productions? How can the global market for the arts be leveraged in order to elicit new forms of cultural production and identity formation? Given the prevalence of global financialization, how can local arts, culture, and heritage brands be protected from commercial appropriation? And again, what opportunities exist for alternative policy formulation for the arts that transgress existing boundaries and policy positions that may retard rather than advance national development and transformation? And in terms of the overview of the book, we've got 3 sections. Part 1 is setting the scene, arts, culture, and the shaping of national identity. And in this section, we investigate the historical foundations of arts in the struggle against apartheid, and we further interrogate divergent and complex stands of the sector in steering the post-1994 democratic project in forging a new nation. Of course, there are other questions or other things that we also do. We generate questions around narrow conceptualization of what is the role of art in a post-apartheid society. And key there is the instrumentalization of the arts as a weapon of destruction of the struggle. And we are beginning to witness a split as cultural workers come to imagine a post-apartheid cultural landscape, how arts and cultural life post-1994 could be released from the burden of historical, the burden of history, and help South Africa reimagine itself anew. And then we've got part 2, everyday development experience, where contributors apply themselves to popular arts and how issues of the quotidian life reveal aspects of the political and cultural economies that are often glossed over by policymakers in favor of cultures that are not ontologically tied to our African localities. And of course, we also demonstrate the achievements of the past 5 years of South Africa's democracy and policy documents produced and extracted from redistribution and development program. And we illustrate how these policy positions emphasize redress, redistribution of resources, national healing and reconciliation. And of course, there are certain chapters that draw important intersections between the arts and everyday experiences, where illustrations are made between the grassroots experiences of the post-1994 democracy and its expression in cultural and artistic forms, and so on and so on. And then we've got part 3 as well, towards social cohesion and collective imagination. Contributors in this section continue to explore the art of the everyday culture as a restaging and reconscientizing site by exploring sites of arts and culture as they affect the government's agenda of social cohesion. There is also how other chapters are actually illustrating the foundational pillars of white supremacy and injustice, and then where the focus is actually on the failure of the policies to redress past injustices and create social cohesion, as evident in the reemergence of discontent throughout the country. The students' call for decolonization in particular has exposed the post-apartheid myth of social cohesion as the limited impact of the ANC reconstruction efforts remain trapped in entrenched systems of racial oppression. And then there are certain chapters that are also illustrating the narratives, new narratives for post-1994 social formations, and how these are actually affected by the contingencies affecting cultural production, the ever complex nation building, access to the digital space, and so on and so on. And of course, there is also chapters that are looking at the art of the migrants, these cross-border kinds of migrants. These are some of the aspects that are actually brought to light because seemingly the policy formulation right from 1996 did not actually factor in the migrant kind of a situation and how they also call South Africa home. And then, of course, we have aspects of that are brought about by COVID-19, youth unemployment, that are also very central to how we have to reimagine the policy going forward in order for the arts and culture and our heritage be actually leveraged by our young people to address future kinds of the contemporary and as well as future kinds of challenges in making South Africa a home for everyone, where national belonging is actually stretched beyond a narrow conceptualization. And probably just to sort of speak to limitations of the book, because we sort of engage that a lot of the time with ourselves and the project coordinators too, is that we sort of eschewed engagement with the constitution of the first people, the Khoisan and Nama people in the country. And we did not speak to aspects of their art, the land rights and the linguistic rights. And this is an unfortunate kind of a situation because globally, as we speak right now, the indigenous rights movement are actually very much central to how they've been made invisible by many layers of our historical epochs that have actually emanated long after their subjugation. So that's basically something that MISTRA should be looking at, how we actually have to shine focus on the first peoples of this country so that they too have got a greater stake in the country, just like the Bantu have got a greater stake in the development of democracy and its entrenchment in South Africa. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof, for that very insightful overview of this research edited volume. And indeed, actions speak for themselves. We are looking I'm looking forward to the book. It will be available in main trade bookshops at the price of 340. All good bookshops will have it. If you would like to make an inquiry, you can make that inquiry to our publications officer, Terry S. at mistra.org.za. And she would be able to facilitate the process of you getting your copy of the book. As Prof has mentioned, it covers various themes between the past, the present, and the future. And of course, governance and the policy recommendations, always important. And those are available on the policy brief that will be shared in the chat. Thank you very much, Prof. We're now going to enter into our panel. We have cited three contributors to speak on their particular chapters, and we'll be introducing them as they make their way up. If we were in a real, launch, we'd have some poetry or a song. So let me know if you want to sing something. Just let me on the direct message, and we can arrange something in the spirit of actions speak for themselves, arts national development in South Africa. Also, we would love to bring attention to an outstanding chapter written by myself and Dr. Atambile Masola, which is in the part 2, looking at South Africa's trade publishing sector. Has there been transformation since, of course, 1994, which looks specifically at your trade publishing sector, which is your leisure reading sector and the transformation of it. Also in the book, also for 340 Rand. And also another colleague of ours here at the Mapungubwe Institute, Njabulo Zwane, has written an extraordinary piece called The Revolution of South African Urban Music, and the ongoing struggle for radical socio-economic transformation, written by himself, Njabulo Zwane, with Thabo Lehlongwa and Ntswaki Hwailane. That particular chapter is dedicated to Lebo Mathosa, as it speaks to our urban culture and music. Very enlightened, very beautiful chapter that you must make sure that you get this particular publication. Sandile, I know he's had connectivity issues. I hope you are here, my leader. We would like to call upon you to speak on your particular chapter written as a co-editor of the publication, but this specific chapter is called Mad, Mad Country, Louis Nkosi's Subversive Text and the Mind of South Africa. Ngiti's bio is as follows. Ubab Shlomuka is an arts activist and an isiZulu English literary translator. In the 90s, Ngiti was General Secretary of the Natal Cultural Congress and later served on the first non-racial board of the Natal Performing Arts Council, now called the Playhouse Company. In 2018, he published a poetry chapbook called You Can't Tell Me Anything Now, published by Mahlepula Press. Ubab Shlomuka previously edited Real Time, a South African human rights and democracy youth magazine, and Baobab, a journal for the arts and new writing. He is a seasoned communication specialist. He has a master's in creative writing from Rhodes University and a bachelor of arts in social science, sociology, and political science from the University of Natal in Durban. Or now called UKZN. I'm revealing your age here, Bab Shlomuka, but over to you. You have 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, my dear sister. Thank you to everybody. I don't know whether they can hear me. Yeah, thank you very much. This is a wonderful moment for me because it's an opportunity, in a sense, to pay tribute to Louis Nkosi, somebody that I got to know in the latter part of his life. But of course, this is the first time for me to write a longish piece on his work, 10 years after he passed on in 2010. Thank you very much. So it's a wonderful opportunity for me to recognize what I consider his legacy and to contribute really, to a broader discussion on his relevance, his timely relevance in South Africa that is fraught with so many challenges at this point, to put it mildly. And I'm trying to say essentially here that from his body of work, we can see a concerted effort of a very, very independent Black mind, very conscious of his Blackness in the world, and driven by the imperatives of the anti-colonial struggle, Black liberation in South Africa in particular, and Black liberation in the world for that matter, constantly critiquing the mind of, the mind of racist South Africa, and saying in different ways that this is a mad, mad, bloody country. And that is why my title captures the theme of madness. And from several of his works, Mating Birds, the Black Psychiatrist, and so on, and even when he's writing his essays, his critical work, Louis Nkosi is constantly drawing us closer to the deeper psychological features of the state we're in, but he's not saying here that the madness he's talking about is a biological madness. It's a madness of political ideologies driven by very, very strong, very, very unrelenting forces of oppression, forces that draw blood from Black people in particular, and forces that seek to disown Black people from their land, to use Christianity and other forms of ideological thinking, so to speak, to keep black people in perpetual bondage. But he's also saying, the psychological features demonstrate a great deal of lies, that have been, a deliberate part of running, white South Africa. And the lies, are catching up with us in several times, in several ways. But our troubled times, bring us back to the ironies of history repeating itself. Who would have thought in 2020, 2021, we'll be talking about a people's government where those that have been entrusted to lead us, to govern us, are so reckless with the resources that are supposed to be shared by all. It's even worse in times of a pandemic that we're all battling with. And I'm saying that our intellectuals, our artists, our thinkers across a wide array of fields must go back to the text, to the work of Louis Ngozi and draw the critiques that are still relevant today. The critique, for instance, of how the black body is beastified, brutalized, and done with, as the system pleases, is one of the major canals of Louis Ngozi's work. And you can see, with incidents like Marikana, the Black Lives Movement, the Black Lives Matter movement in the US and other parts of the world, the killing of Collins, Chauke, if I'm not mistaken, in Alexander at the beginning of our first lockdown. It is very, very easy, even in a post-apartheid dispensation, to brutalize black bodies, let alone women, let alone, the scourge of gender-based violence, that is so much a national sport, so to speak, in this country at the moment. A crazy sport, of course, a mad sport, if one puts it that way. So in Louis Ngozi, we're revisiting the critique of South Africa that remains extremely relevant, and in its relevance, are elements that sharpen, our consciousness, particularly for people who had hoped the new dispensation would deliver, their freedom, almost in a complete sense. But we all know that whiteness has not been defeated. In fact, what whiteness, continues to do is to mutate itself, to reinvent itself, and to invite some of us to be the custodians of this ideology that seeks to keep the status quo intact. And in the essay, I also referenced Mating Birds, which is one of which is possibly the most well-known novel that Louis Ngozi published, his debut novel in 1986, where he gets into the heart and the mind of his beloved country, from exile. And I also make reference to the controversial essays on Black fiction that he published in the 60s, where he was basically searching for what I call the musicality of home, suggesting that our writers, our Black writers who were writing fiction at the time, could do better. And saying, in fact, that great art is a form of revolution. There's no disjuncture between somebody who articulates himself or herself well in his or her art and the endeavors of a people to liberate themselves from the clutches of colonialism and apartheid. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Babungidi. And there will be a space for small discussions, quite soon. So now I'd like to call upon, now I would like to share with you the cover as promised, created by Breeze Yoko, who created this mural, and we'd just like to keep acknowledging him and honoring him for this outstanding work. I would now like to call Dr. Refilwe Lepere, who is a journalist, playwright, theater director, and drama therapist and facilitator. She's a graduate of the New York University and the University of Witwatersrand. Her research looks at how race and gender intersect to frame and shape our understanding of and interaction with sorry, colleagues, with the world. Her work entails creating a dialogue between race and feminist theory, social justice, and theater making practice, drama therapy, and human rights. Her international plays include Between Sisters, which is what this particular chapter focuses on, Postcards, Bodily Preserves, which was in Germany, South Africa, and the US. A play called Money for Shoes, which was in Botswana, in South Africa, and Swaziland. A play called Heading Out, which was in the US and the UK. And Songs for Kwezi, which was in South Africa and United States. And as well as Disappearing Act and Black in the Box, which was in United States and Canada. Thank you very much, Doc, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Annelile and the MISTRA team. I'd like to take a moment to really appreciate the generous organizers of this gathering, the team and the virtuosic staff of MISTRA, the director of MISTRA, Joel Nechitenze. And I'd like to also acknowledge fellow writers who are here in the meeting, and the editors of the volume, Prof. Mhlambi and Sandilengiti. Thank you so much for creating this space and for us to have a moment of pause and celebration and reflection. As said, I am a playwright, a director, a drama therapist, and an academic. And to index my piece and to talk about my chapter in the book, I'd like to first of all to share a poem that I really use in most of my work right now because it really speaks back to the work that I've been working on. And it's the poem by Alice Walker that goes, "And they were women, then, my mother's generation, husky of voice, stout of step, their fists as well as hands, how they battered down doors, ironed out starched shirts, how they led armies, head-ragged generals across mined fields, booby-trapped ditches to discover books, desks, a place for us, how they knew what we must know without knowing a page of it themselves." So I situate my work in a moment and in a space and in a history of Black women as radical subjects in history. Quoting Hartman, I'm of that wild idea that animates me, that Black women are radical subjects who tirelessly imagine other ways to live and never fail to consider how the world might be otherwise. So in this paper, I assert a political and ideological utility of domesticity or the home as both an idea and a material space that I use in performance. The home is both a space for making and a space for creating. I tell the broader story of a Black woman and her life, and as an engagement to fight for a decency, for freedom, and for well-being. I invest in the body and the ways that the Black woman's body becomes a material for archiving of knowledge and production. So using the play that I created in 2016, Between Sisters, as a way of analyzing the social relational structures of how Black women's bodies mitigate access and freedom. I use the play to also interrogate how Black feminist aesthetic interrogates domestic ideologies and how this becomes this Black spatial project of the home as a space with freedom and labor and concepts of reproduction, creative labor, and self-definition can happen. So we created characters, two sisters who then engage with their Black madam. And in this play, these women engage with performance of, and different performances of what does it mean to become a Black madam in a new day South Africa. And through this, they engage and think about what are the indicators of Blackness, how are the indicators of how we think of a domestic worker. And normally in South Africa, we know it's this ghostly figure that exists in our homes and that kind of haunts our own existence of what does it mean to be South African in this current situation. What these women do in that play out, they think about, and we use the home as a portal into thinking about what is language, what is these cultural markers that mark us as women in the home, and how do we then imagine ourselves out of this home. So the two sisters sit and engage and talk about what does it mean to be themselves, but they also imagine worlds beyond the home. They use the interior decoration, the concept of set design, the concept of gesture, and sartorial use of their clothing and their interior lives to explain how they might navigate the world and what their choices they're making in terms of exposing precarity, racial oppression, and class positionality. And through a couple of discussions, I link and draw on the Black women experience in the home and how they engage with each other to also to think about a broader concept of theater aesthetic in South Africa. I discuss a historical formation of how we think about Black aesthetic in South Africa, and thinking through the idea that in South Africa, there are those two parallel existence of a Black aesthetic. So there's the one that is what Black consciousness movements scholars talk about, that it is the Black theater, which is theater made by Black people, and then there's Black theater made with Black people. So in that way, I divide and conquer and kind of think about what is that structure and how does it then entail in the way that we then create gestures? How do we create in terms of what do we look at when we're thinking of an aesthetic way of reading? I discuss how through these women's experiences of shame, complexity, and the domestic labors and pains that they experience at work and in their workspaces, we can reimagine what a radical subject is. We know in Marx, the radical subject is the worker. We know in Black consciousness, the radical subject is the Black male, but here in Black feminist aesthetic, I am rooting it in the philosophy that in thin beauty, there must be a way of being human, and therefore the Black radical subject is this, that takes center stage is a Black female, where Black women are the main central characters in their interior lives, their interior spaces, their homes, their way they think about themselves, the story they tell each other and themselves drive the storyline. And finally, the play is not just linear, it's not about just time and space, but it's about how we correlate the linearity of time and space and make and recreate worlds that are able to impact on the world outside. We look at the roles of both madam and maids in extensive ways and as clear markers of oppression, markers of invisibility, markers of silence and hidden. And I argue that that there's a need for a Black definition of a Black feminist aesthetic that allows for we women to use their own stories and bodies as a discursive space and a material to examine the possibilities for creating interventions, strategies, and interruptions of what is obstructing out there. What are the gaps, the pauses, the logistical counterparts that are happening in the world? And how can we contest the enclosures that we struggle with in the art space? I think about creative labor also, and think about how the invisibility of the domestic worker also highlights and speaks and kind of like haunts us as Black women within the art space, as our work sometimes has become ghostly and quiet, and that our work our work has been the way that we've been situated in the back foot. So I make a claim that there is a gesture and there is a way of creating that communicates, that comes from our own work, that is maybe silences, that may be groans, that may be song. In the way of closing, I'm not sure if I have, but in my way of closing, I want to suggest, which is not in this chapter, but it's something that I'm thinking through and working through. And because of what this process of writing this paper brought to my own life, the idea of policy and changing positions and locations, and what does that need? What can one really imagine about policy? And how do I then locate my own work within a policy framework? And I want to use the idea of home as a measure of policy, and thinking of home using Isoke's words, and she says, home, the kitchen, is a place where we hatch strategies for our next uprising. The kitchen, the place where we speak freely and practice caring for one another. I want to think through with Angela Davis when she says, home, as in the slave quarters, were Black women's spaces of private space, of rehearsal and resistance, where Hooks thinks of home as not as paradise, but a place where paradise can be created, a location of possibility, an opportunity to labor for freedom, to collectively imagine ways to move beyond our boundaries. So therefore, home becomes not just the narrowing, limiting space where Black women can be just held at home, but becomes a space and a place where innovative Black artistry can exist and can influence how we think about the world and our country, where we can rethink aesthetic not only as a historical and a critical thing, but also as a measure of knowing and what the world might be and that we may create. The play does not prescribe. At most, it leaves questions on what it means to be a Black female worker and a Black employer. It reveals the exploitative nature of our relations, but also how unpaid labor of women is always left at the back end. As a Black woman theater director, the theme of Black women as radical, complex characters is important for me. It is a currency that uncovers unique positionality, and it also allows for the tensions and contradictions and highlights gender politics, Black female labor, and the struggle for creativity. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Wow, wow, wow. Thank you so much, Vulavula. That was absolutely thought-provoking and really just too many adjectives coming to my mind. But colleagues in the in the chat, Refilwe's chapter is available in the book. The book will cost you 340. Terry's details are in the chat, and it will be later on available on all good bookshops. And Refilwe's talk just kind of reminded me of something else that she said in an interview with SAFM for this particular publication, around how artists and the creative economy cannot just be entertainers, because we are consumers of, all of us are consumers of arts, all of us, we are fragile to arts, all of us, we need it for healing, for restoration, for different reasons. And sometimes arts is the only way that we can actually articulate ourselves in a way that matters, or in a way that can be communicated to others. And which is a very important framework of thinking when we look at how to put this into legislature, into policy, into law and things like that, and how to fully and be able to execute that in actionable steps with regards to the country's policies. But thank you very much, Doc. That was very enlightening, and I'm a fan of your work, and this chapter was absolutely phenomenal. Maybe it's because I'm a Black woman too. Moving on to our last panelist, an art critic. When we hope, well, you're popular, Artie, for criticizing a lot, but Artie Mongezeleli Georgia is one of the contributors of this volume. His particular chapter is called About Race, a critical appraisal of the concept of cultural work. He is an art critic and theorist. He's a member of the Artist Collective, Gugulective, and a member of the Azanian Philosophical Society. Georgia was also part of the editorial collective, New Frank Talk, critical essays on the Black condition. He publishes art criticism, critical opinion pieces, and polemics on local and international art platforms such as Africana.org, Artthrob, Mail and Garden, Art Forum, and Art South Africa. Georgia's work homes in on the questions of art and politics, liberation aesthetics, and art criticism. In 2018, he was an Andrew Mellon pre-doctoral fellow in the critical theory cluster at the University of Northwestern in Minnesota, where he developed a curriculum on appropriation together with an art historian, Professor Huey Copeland. In 2021, Georgia will be the Edith Krieger Wolf Distinguished Visiting Professor in the Department of Art History in the University of Northwestern. He will teach a semester course on South African art and the transition to democracy. Thank you so much, Ati. We are again amongst really great, real greatness, and we can't wait to hear your presentation. Over to you.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you to MISTRA for this wonderful opportunity. I'm really grateful that I've managed to put together this chapter, this book chapter. It has been one of those things that I've been thinking about for quite some time regarding the role, the conceptual role and reach of the concept of cultural work. What do we mean when we talk about cultural work or cultural workers? And the chapter is an attempt to historicize and theorize and polemically engage even with that concept, its genealogy, and how it has somehow become or rather treated as a kind of self-explanatory concept of within the fraternity of cultural production. And I was always kind of uncertain about how thinkers would use this concept and use it in such a way as some kind of traveling concept, meaning in the form of Edward Said's sense of the traveling theory, in such a way that it became one of those things that are self-explanatory. And in terms of trying to explain the role or theorize the role of culture of liberation or liberation aesthetics, Black aesthetic, all of these, or even literature of protests, all of these concepts or ideas all of a sudden at a particular time became sublated or interpolated through the prism of cultural work. And this had unsettled me in so many ways. And I'd been trying to find ways of disrupting this kind of commonsensical acceptance of the concept of cultural work. So what I do in the chapter is to poke holes with regards to the concept, and to show that our uses of it are part of a larger political, theoretical corruption of ideas, right? And I begin by making a point of criticizing the concept of work, which is aligned to the concept of cultural work. And by doing that, I'm following the work of the Black radical tradition, which has had what's the word? Made intervention on how work has also become what Katie Weeks calls, with regards to work, as she calls it, the model of resistance. And my critique has always been the fact that work trumps up, crowds out, displaces the real reason behind the colonization of Black people. Or rather, work is one of those terms that limits the historical experiences of Black people. That Black people are not colonized. Their colonization is not a situation predicated on their exploitation in the labor market. And I argue that through the prism of or framework of Black radical tradition, that the concept of cultural work emerges precisely from this Marxian left-wing hegemonic discourse that displaces the real historical experiences of Black people. And in fact, displaces the radical potentiality of Black radical traditions or Black nationalist tendencies in South Africa. And so relying on, for example, the works of people like Cedric Robinson, Franco Pachesi, who's done incredible work on critiquing the commonsensical acceptance of work, particularly the ANC and the Communist Party, and in the left-wing trajectory as well. But in my thinking about the concept of cultural work, I try to locate it because one of the things that always fascinated me was that when people use the concept, they will talk of cultural work as, as something that existed in the 1930s when Dlomo was writing, or someone like Ernest Mancoba was writing or doing work, or in the 1950s, in the 1960s, in the 1970s. All of these people, and this does not necessarily include people who are Marxist identifying human beings or activists. And it also includes even people within the Black consciousness tradition, or even people within the Africanist tradition. To talk about cultural workers is such a commonsensical thing, but no one has really historicized it, theorized it. No? So what I do in the chapter is to show, firstly, of course, as I said, by criticizing, or rather showing the limits of foregrounding work, or the discourse of work, or the experiences of the labor market as the primary experiences of Black people, as opposed to, other ones, land dispossession and so forth and so on. And I link this to rather the evolution of the concept of cultural work with groups, left-wing groups, non-racial left-wing groups in the US, particularly the Art Workers Coalition, and argue that for the Art Workers Coalition, the concept of art, because the cultural worker particularly rejects the individualistic orientation of modern art's investment in, use a common phrase, the room of one's own, the individual artist, and rejects that to make room for the possibility of the collective experience. And the cultural worker emerges as the field or the space for a collective imagination, a collective practice. So I'm saying this had emerged somewhere else in the late 1960s in the US with the Art Workers Coalition, and that has its relationship in art history with the emergence of new Marxism or new feminist discourses. In art history, you would have people like about T.J. Clark, whose work I deal with in the piece, people like I've forgotten now, a number of people who actually are part of the tradition of social history of art. And as I said, this concept does not emerge in South Africa up until late 1970s, particularly after the banning of Black consciousness movement. But the way it is used as if it has always been, or rather it is used as some kind of, it has this political reach that extends far back into even the 1930s, 1950s. And I had problems with this. So, for example, you would find someone like great literary scholar, Pegasus Peterson, talking about the renaissance of the cultural work in the 1970s. Or you would find the same thing in the text Biko Lives, edited by Andile Mutama, Nigel Gibson, Amanda Alexander, talking about the marvelous cultural work of BC poets and novelists. And this, of course, is absurd. There's no such thing as cultural work amongst BC intellectual. At least the term doesn't exist at the time. The term only exists after the banning of Black consciousness. That is my primary argumentation. And the reason why it emerges immediately after the burning, and yes, but primary to that is that, the art historian who's now done work on iconography of Black consciousness, something Hill, Shannon Hill, in a book called Biko's Ghost, also makes these very strange treatments of these concepts, or rather the place of Black consciousness after its influences of Black consciousness after 1977, without necessarily treating how the concept itself functions as part of, first, on one side, the destruction and the destroying of Black consciousness by the apartheid regime, and also by the liberation movement in general. If you remember, a lot of people would remember that, you have people like Abongosa Zanazuma and many other people who came out of Black consciousness, started calling Black consciousness like a minor stage in the liberation movement. It's an infantile moment, and you got this literally from everywhere. And these became part of the justifications to undermine Black consciousness. And the term cultural work, rather its extension as the concept that means almost everything that has to do with liberation practice in the cultural sector, follows that kind of theme. So it's an attempt to problematize the hegemony of that concept, not only in relation to Black consciousness, but I use it primarily because its relationship to Black consciousness, because it emerges immediately after the Black consciousness movement, to mark some kind of non-racialist hegemonic discourse through the concept of the worker. And I argue, insofar as by arguing that in fact, the concept of cultural work itself, the way it has been used, forms part of the imperialistic discourse or discourses that put Black people in service of other people's agendas, and undermines the singularity and particularity of Black people's experiences. So then I go into how this, for example, in Medu Art Ensemble, the use of this term, the commonsensical use of this term, was primarily rather catapulted by the erasure of the Black agenda within MEDU, within community arts project, and many other collective bodies that emerged after Black consciousness. Yeah, so that is more or less where I am with the thing. It's part of an ongoing discussion that I'm trying to raise about the over-essentialization of work in the South African historical thinking, South African historiography, art historiography in particular, and how these traveling concepts are accepted without any kind of critical reception. I mean, there's many others. I mean, concepts such as the poors and they've been accepted by historians and theorists and cultural thinkers without any kind of critical engagement with their historical evolutions or genealogy and all of that stuff.
Yes.
Okay, so yeah, that's where I am. People can just check the chapter out. Thank you.
Yes, people must not know exactly what's in the chapter.
All right, okay.
Thank you so much, Mongezeleli Chocha. That was very insightful and very thought-provoking. And I'm sure that people have noted their questions and their comments to a lot of the things that you have said in order to get the discussion going. But before the discussion, we'd just like to call upon one of South Africa's legends, an idol, and I mean, Mandla Langa, who was born in 1950 in Durban and went to exile in 1976 and has lived in Botswana, Mozambique, Angola, Hungary, Zambia, and the United Kingdom. For him in 1980 to win Drum Magazine's Africa Wide Story Contest, and in 1991 was awarded the Arts Council of Great Britain bursary for creative writing. Mandla Langa was the cultural representative of the ANC in the UK and Western Europe. He has been a columnist for various newspapers and was the convener of the Task Group on Government Communications in 1997, which restructured apartheid's communication systems. From 1999 to 2005, he chaired the Independent Communications Authority of SA, ICASA. In 2007, he received the National Order of Ikamanga in silver for his literary and journalistic contribution to democracy. In 1999 to 2000, he wrote a book of the musical milestones, which featured music by Huma Sigel. His published works include Tenderness of Blood, A Rainbow on a Paper Sky, The Naked Song, and Other Stories. The Memory of Stones, The Lost Colors of the Chameleon, which won the 2009 Commonwealth Prize for Best Book in the African region, and The Texture of Shadows in 2014. He co-authored Dare Not Linger with Nelson Mandela's Archives in 2017 and was a fellow at the Stellenbosch Institute for Advanced Studies. Mandla Langa is a recipient of honorary doctorates from universities of Fort Hare and Wits, respectively. Mandla sits on numerous boards, such as the MultiChoice, Pomanati, and Prime Media, and is a trustee of Media Monitoring Africa. He's married to June Josephs, and they have 4 children. And he's also the author of one of my favorite poems, but it's not about me, but we beg your pardon, South Africa. Thank you so much for your presence. We do not take it lightly. We are honored to have you as a respondent to these particular themes and conversations that we've been having. Bablanga, please, over to you.
Thank you very much for this very generous introduction. I just wanted to say that I would like to thank MISTRA, Joel, Abba, the editors, the artists, and everyone who has been involved in this I get excited every time a book is launched, especially if it's a book that contains kernels of insightful truths that are so important to our country, where it's always very necessary to foreground the arts and culture and their essentiality towards knitting together the discrete pieces of this tapestry we call our society. Very many insightful contributions have been made by the panelists, and I think I will speak later about my own views when we get to the discussion. But I want to start with what Sandile Ngidi Hlomoga gave us this morning, bearing in mind that I'm aware of the time that I'm given 10 minutes. And as a faithful and disciplined cadre of MISTRA, I will make sure that I stick to the guideline. Sandile's Ngidi's contribution is a tribute to the legacy of Louis Nkosi, and he raises quite a number of issues regarding Louis Nkosi, and anyone that knows or knew or has read Louis Nkosi knows that he's one very sharp, incisive mind that takes no prisoners. And he uses his prose like a scalpel, really, when it comes to dissecting what our society has been up to. And Ngidi takes us through some of the issues that, or bugbears, or things that Nkosi was preoccupied with. For instance, he was very conscious of the role of the writer and the rush, perhaps, with which Black writers took to putting pen to paper. And he critiques that and wants people to align themselves with the conventions and to have the requisite skills and the requisite tools with which to engage in their writing. And so he has been criticized by other people who feel that his criticism does not take on board the urgency of having for people to reflect what is happening in the country. And if they do that in bad English or so-called bad English, it doesn't matter. The message is what matters. And he has been told in no uncertain terms by other writers that English is no longer a language for the English. In fact, English is wasted on the English. And Ngidi speaks about an issue which is current now, the prophetic vision of Louis Nkosi, the fact that in some way what he writes foregrounded or foresaw or foreshadowed some of the excesses by the present dispensation. The most important takeaway from it is to what extent do we then, as people involved in culture, understand the, I'll call it the sanctity of the Black body, the fact that it has been overlooked, it has been abused, and it has been taken for granted, and it has been cheapened if you look at what is happening, as Ngiti reminds us, in Marikana, and also this scourge or this other epidemic that's ongoing in our country of the violation or the violence against the women, or against women and children. These are some of the things that I took from Sandile. And we were told about the cover, and the cover really is beautiful. I agree with you. And I'm waiting to get a copy of my book. I prefer to buy my book myself. As a writer, I know that books are writers are always struggling. And so instead of being given a freebie, I'll want to go and buy my own book and another one to give for Valentine's Day. Refilwe Lipere, I really was absolutely gobsmacked and very, very interested in your talk. And you took me to another realm when you started with a prayer, because a poem from a person like Alice Walker is not just a poem, but it's an invocation. And so that made me very interested in listening to what you were saying, this tapestry that I was talking about earlier, and the ingenious use of theater, not only as a genre, as a mode of reflecting the activities of society, but as something also which, in your case, is a vehicle for women to reimagine the world and to envision the home as a space for creating, and the body. Those three things for me stood out. A body as a place for archiving knowledge. There's been a lot which I think as a man, I find myself always being woken up to when it comes to understanding what is the Black feminist aesthetic. And I think it's an evolutionary thing, and one grows on an everyday basis to understand. And I think through such encounters and through such interactions and through such contributions, this dawn of this awakening to understanding begins. And there are questions that are posed. What does it mean to be a Black madam in South Africa? I really would have loved to see that play, because what I think is also a play within a play that uses itself to critique not only society, but even the people who are themselves involved in the enactment of that scenario. And you speak about home as a portal and the two sisters imagining a world beyond the home. And then, excuse me. And then the most important thing was, to what extent are the issues that you are dealing with, to what extent can we see them located within a policy environment, and so on. Thanks. Artie is concerned about the conceptual role and reach and what we mean by the concept of cultural work. Cultural work is a phrase, is a term which Artie feels has been treated as he puts it, as a self-explanatory concept, and uses Edward Said's note on a traveling concept. He speaks about liberation culture, Black aesthetics being subsumed under the definition of cultural work, if I've got him right. And this troubles him immensely. And he pokes holes with regards to the concept and seizes it as a corruption of an idea. And the most important thing about this is how the concept of cultural work displaces the real reason behind the colonization of Black people, and argues that this concept of cultural work derives from or finds sustenance from Marxian or looking at Black people who are involved in artistic activity through the Marxian leftist prism. And this displaces the radical potentiality of Black artists. I might have, and then that's the question of cultural work came after the banning of the Black consciousness movement, and that this is an idea, and the Black consciousness movement has been its role in the politics or in the life of South Africa has been eluded, as it were, has been ironed out by this conceptual assault, as it were, but also by the liberation movement itself. And I think when we discuss, there are some points I would like to make, especially, for instance, some of the formations that Artie speaks about, Medu, because I was one of the people involved in the formation of Medu, and I think for me it almost comes as a shock that I was actually a tool of white hegemonistic ideas. Be that as it may, I think this is a very important contribution and will go a long way in animating our conversations and our discussions and our understanding of our country and what has gone on in the past and is going on today to make it what it is. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a very detailed and very specific response. And we now, I'm looking at the chat to see if there are any questions. Colleagues, you're very welcome to post your questions in the chat for our panelists. The panelists are still online and are available to answer your questions or just your generic comments. But since there aren't any currently, I want to be opportunistic and give Judge Albie Sachs an opportunity if he can be, I don't know if he's willing to be unmuted and to give us some insights, because he did play a vital and critical role in the formation of this particular publication. And his is a chapter, not necessarily a chapter, but it's a conversation with him, which is in the laying, in the setting the scene of the book, and looking at the historical context of how we find ourselves in arts and culture are not weapons of, but part of the struggle for social transformation, in conversation with Judge Albie Sachs. Is my opportunism welcome?
I'm ready.
Thank you. The floor is
Okay,
yours.
well, this has been a fabulous discussion. It's very, very hard because it challenges a huge amount of activity that I've been involved in. And I also challenged the term cultural work, but from a different perspective to the very beautiful, thoughtful presentation. But I think this is marvelous. This is point and counterpoint, and each phase in the evolution of society and the evolution of cultural ideas, even in the work of MISTRA, means challenging lots of things that were given in the past. The one big theme that came through to me is the question of Blackness, and Black coming through the different presentations as something needing its own space, its own liberation, its own intelligence, its own energy, which is marvelous and powerful. And it energized our whole struggle and our whole movement. And when the Black consciousness people came into the struggle in the 70s, they brought a vitality and an energy, and people like Mandla and Joel are products of Black consciousness, and they bear that with them all the time. But for me, the paradigm, if you like, of the person who had the biggest influence on me, and I'm throwing my evaluation of him into the pot and stirring it a little bit, was Oliver Tambo. When I was blown up and I had scars, somebody, an ANC person, said, "It's wonderful. The Boers have Africanized you. They've given you scars like Oliver Tambo." And I feel so proud now to be identified with that person. And he was a profound Black intellectual, political leader, a commander, and even a priest. And what I felt with him was his Blackness gave him the pride and the strength to incorporate the best of the world. So Christianity wasn't the enemy. Through Christianity, he got a spirituality and a capacity to reach out, but imbued with the Black experience. Revolutionary struggles and some imposed leftist agenda being put upon the struggle. It was an instrument that would enable him as a Black person to reach out to the world, to connect up with yellow people and brown people and even white people. So Blackness for him then was a source of strength. He didn't feel victimized by that world outside. He felt it gave him pride and strength to embrace the world, and as a Black person to provide leadership to the world. And that's what I got from Oliver Tambo. That's what I got from Nelson Mandela. I get from people like Joel and others. It's a feeling that the Blackness is not defensive. It's not self-referential. It reaches out. It embraces. And then this comes through in the cultural expression of almost conquering the world, Black idiom, in the same way Amanda did at the inauguration in Washington. She expressed a Blackness reaching out to the world, not kowtowing to the world, not sucking up to the world. And these are some intuitive responses that I get. I think this is a marvelous dialogue. It's very, very rich. I feel sometimes a little bit superannuated in terms of I'm still stuck to some extent in the battles of the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, let alone the 20s. But it's fabulous. Let the show move on. Congratulations to MISTRA for organizing it. And we need this openness of debate. And the last point is, what I love is the reverence for ideas, that ideas are important and ideas challenge other ideas. The articulation has been so fine and so strong and so effective. May the debate continue.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. This launch has been really full of such amazing insights. We've really been surrounded by great people. And the baton has been passed on. And through your insights in that first part of the book, which looks at the historical context, we have colleagues like Barry Gilder, we have, okay, Ati his chapter is also situated in there. We have Ubaba Serote, and really just Andries Walter Oliphant and the likes. And in that second part, like we had spoken before, myself and Jabulo Zwane, Tabole Hlongwa, Atambile Masola, really just looking at the present state and in the specific developmental experiences. And in that last part, really looking at now the future and the digitization of the creative economy, and looking at case studies and migrant imagination, researching art, the art of Africa and the continent at large. This has been such an amazing conglomerate, and it's been great to work with the people that we have been able to work with and to have access to the likes of South Africa's greatness. Let me just see here in the chat screen if there's any comments or question. Maybe the speakers can also expand on how we can avoid English word, the arts, considering that the time is immemorial. Arts and culture have been used as a form of communication and also as a form to express people's views and frustrations. Can we not then use it as a stick to whip those in power? Interesting question there from our project coordinator, Dr. Zenzo Moyo. And I don't know if any of the speakers would like to take a bite at that particular comment. I can just alert me. And of course, contributors at large into the publication can also just raise their hands if they have something that they'd like to share with us in these last couple of minutes before our launch is over. Please also be mindful of our social media, at MISTRA_SA on Twitter, Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection on Facebook, just to carry on the conversation, just to make sure that we continue talking about these important matters, even post this particular launch, because really it's just points on points on points, power on power on power on power. I don't know, Ati, Rufilwe, Sandile, Prof. Mhlambi, if you'd like to, if any one of you would like to to respond to Zenzo's question in the chat, please, this is the time. Thanks, Prof.
I've always, actually, I'm struggling to get another question through to you. The role of artists in providing perspective during the pandemic has been almost sidelined or is slow in coming, and why is that? Just to sort of link that up with Zenzo's question, that can't we use it to actually equip those in power currently? I still feel that one would actually narrow things when we actually look at art as a weapon of as an instrument to talk back to power. That's really true. But at the same time, what if, especially in the context of South Africa, where there is this kind of an outcry, where the mainstream media has actually been seen to be failing people in actually being a watchdog for the people at large, and art then becomes the only kind of a platform for them to be able to speak back to power. And not only mainstream kind of arts, but also grassroots forms of art, just to actually generate a very heightened kind of a consciousness as to what is happening in the country, especially during the period of the pandemic, as you've seen, that it had actually sharpened the kinds of divides, the economic divides, the cultural divides, the social divides that had always been sort of dogging our post-apartheid era. For me, art in its many kinds of manifestations and expressions, especially as they evolved in South Africa, remain the heritage. We cannot sort of overlook the many kinds of heritages that we've got that had been actually worked through over time by art to actually fight for surface expression. So for me, I agree with Senzo. We can still continue to use it as an instrument for conscientizing people, for speaking back to power, especially in the age where there is just no alternatives for the people on the ground. We've just seen on television people being sprayed with water for standing together because they are going to be collecting 350 rands. And we've just seen people not getting the groceries that were meant for them. We've just seen people dying because of lack of PPEs, because money had been squandered, and the corruption at the many levels of our rulers. And if in the mainstream media, there's just minimal kind of attention to some of these anomalies in the country, then art must actually be used to actually raise pertinent issues, even in instrumental kinds of ways, just as we've seen in the 1970s and 1980s. So definitely, I still feel that it's still relevant. It's one of those heritages that we cannot do away with. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. In complete agreement with you, art indeed must be utilized. Dr. Lepere, please, I see your hand is up.
Thank you so much, Annelile. So my response, I mean, I think the instrumentalization of art is this is why we're in a problem that we have right now as artists, because we constantly are just the sideshow, right? We're the people to then make other people aware, but we're not doing that. We're not the core part of the work. And I think that for me becomes, and I think that's the way to think about that. How do you centralize ourselves in a way that we, even in our own thinking about the art form, that it becomes, we become radical and radical ways of thinking about the art form, rather than it always consistently being about a response to and a way of just having to answer back. And of course, and totally, I'm a scholar of the arts, I'm an artist, I live off my art form, I make my, right? But I think this idea that we're consistently being used as entertainment, as used as consistently just, the voice. I mean, it's the same problem that women are having, like we can't always be the voice of, right? The voice of this. And I mean, I'm not even particularly sure around the possibility of what then happens if we're not just the voice or the instrument of, right? But I think there is an innovative way to think about a centrality of ourselves as radical subjects, and how we then create and make in such a way that doesn't always have to isn't always in response to, but is always can be a futuristic way of creating and making and imagining a world that we all dream about. I think there's a way that we all noticed that within the COVID moment, the centrality of the art form. And then suddenly we want to say that, oh, we all were listening to music, we all were reading books, we all were watching a lot of series and movies and right, and a lot of online theater and all of that. So there's clearly a centrality of the art form within our lives that it is part of our everyday, but we're not being innovative enough to say, in this thing that is our central, it's the central making and what it means to be human for us, how then does it also allow for us to shape what we become, who we become, rather than consistently being at the back foot of it, were used as Batli saying atau thing or whatever, right? And that thing. And then I want to also just speak back to the idea of this idea of an imagining of a future or ways of performing. So I think part of what I do with the play and then the piece is to talk about these performances that we do, and that the two sisters do, because they are imagining what a future could be. They play out the possibilities and they question each other and they critique themselves, of course. They critique their own desires for, and like this capitalist desire of another, of a big home, of this, of what we imagine what a madam is, of the role of the madam. And then I question myself, and I question the characters, and I question that what is it that we have walked into? So that idea that we have just walked into the shoes and the role that have been set up for us without having to have questioned how we imagine ourselves into a new role. We have gone into those roles of madam and maid without thinking, how else could this relationship work without it being as it looks like in the historical past, and now it's the same ghostly experience as we're having it now. And I think that is an important conversation, because to have in parallel with what we're saying about the arts, how are we not allowing the hauntings of a past that is consistently about the sidelining of the arts and it being this, but as we know it and as we experience it, it's the centrality of it. So how do we reimagine that role as artists and the role as creators and makers, that we can imagine a new world or imagine where we could be taking it, I think.
Thank you. And I think what you're saying is coming through here in the comments with, before Ati, you come in, is it fair to place weights of, sorry, colleagues, is it fair to place weights of liberation and enlightenment on the arts and the artists, when the arts are the least empowered in our capitalist society? And if arts is used as a survival skill, is it not then also susceptible to corruption? And Fazil says, not to deny that as its potential role too, but that would also be to instrumentalize the role of the arts. For me, the arts are essentially about expression and evocation of the deep, hidden, complex, intangible dimensions that which uniquely makes us human. And indeed, it's a sacred space, but it's also a space that we occupy, a space that we need. It's a space where we get healing. It's a space where we get clarity. As Rifilo has been saying, that look, during COVID, really, books were sold, we were watching, we were consuming. There was even a Friday night lockdown house party, because that is how people needed to be fulfilled in order to exist, in order to fulfill their roles in their respective spaces, whether in corporate, whether in the household, whether anywhere else. And arts was definitely instrumental in that. And yet artists are not finding the creative economy to be on the uprise. I don't know, Ati, you'd want to come in?
Well, my thing is this. Firstly, I think Zenzo's question, if one reads carefully, is saying two things at the same time that are contradictory. On one side, he's saying we must avoid instrumentalization of art. And then on this other side, it says, can we use art as a stick to whip those in power? And this tension, I find it productive at the same time, even if it might be an error on his part to say one thing and then finish the sentence by saying another thing, is that it actually speaks about the concerns that emerged from, one would say even date back as Louis Ngosi. We spoke about Louis Ngosi earlier, 1960s, the likes of Nadine Gordimer in the 70s, Njabulon Ndebele in the 80s, and Albie Sachs in the late 80s. The fact that there is this tension about whether we should instrumentalize art or not, or rather, the question has always been how and why and for what purpose is art instrumentalized or used, and this is at the heart of what in the late 80s or early 90s was usually called the South African, the devising of a South African cultural expression. On one side, it posed the possibility of instrumentalizing art in a particular way, but it itself never avoided the possibility of art being instrumentalized in another way. So instrumentalization is part and parcel of art, even when art assumes a position of speaking for itself, as opposed to use or fulfilling an agenda of politics, of whatever kind of, position. It is always dialectically related to some kind of administrative, instrumentalist possibility. It only depends. Back then it was, let's not instrumentalize art for liberation, or rather close the possibility that the role of art is simply to combat, or to, as an expression, which now is of course quite a plastic one, art as the weapon of liberation. But, again, to bring back Louis Ngosi, to bring back a number of people who have contested the substitutive consequences of that critique, that now art is an instrument of capitalism. That South African art, South African contemporary art, is not only overwhelmingly owned by instruments of capital, it facilitates the possibility for a capitalist agenda. It is critical of it, but it's critical within the reach and power of, because it needs capital. The state doesn't fund art, as Breeze was arguing, and therefore art is always susceptible to corruption. State capture images point to how art is at that point in time an instrument of racist imagination, an instrument of facilitating the possibility of one kind of capital capture against another form of capital capture. So art has no autonomy. Because there's no social community-based position for art. We've eradicated art in the communities. There are no art centers anymore under the watch of the government and the ruling party. So art is susceptible to one instrument, and that instrument is white monopoly capital and white supremacy, who are the people who own the means of production. You know what I'm saying? So art is, you cannot function without art being the instrument of the current boss. Well, it's always been the boss since it's 52. So it is instrumentalized, but it is not instrumentalized to whip. And even if it whips according and in tune with those who are in power.
No, thank you very much. And I can see that our time is up. I don't know, Babulanga, if you have something to say, just 2 seconds, 2 minutes, I would be able to give you this this chance before I call on our Director of Operations to wrap up and close our meeting. No? Yes.
Hi, hello. Yes, I just want to thank the MISTRA again, and to say that one of the things that we need to seriously guard against is the scourge or the problem of cynicism, of looking at things from using a prism of how bleak everything is and looking at the moment of today as if it's always going to be like this. Because I think art has helped South Africans to wiggle out of incredibly tight situations and to, once artists are able to help us to frame, to have a vision of the future, then we then are able to be optimistic. And all the art formations that were there in the past were preparing us for this today, the kinds of issues that we are grappling with today. And I think that we should not be looking at today using the eye of the past. That is a mistake. That's all I can say for the time.
Thank you, Sotumase Sebonga Kulu, for your presence and also for your powerful insights. To close off our meeting, colleagues, it's been an outstanding launch. I personally would like to thank you for following my house rules. You've made the job of facilitating very easy. I'd like to call on our Director of Operations, Dr. Abba Omar, who will be providing the concluding remarks. And he's feeling very artistic there. I'm glad we've got
I had to make sure I found the best space in my room to highlight the artistic background. So thank you, Anlile. Colleagues, friends of MISTRA, as most of you may be aware, I have just rejoined MISTRA after a 4-year hiatus in the heart of white monopoly capital. But when I was asked to perform this duty of doing the closing remarks, I jumped to it immediately. I like hanging around artists and people that write about artists and cultural workers, the creatives. And I appreciate the point you're making about how we need to problematize the various terms that we're using, and I'm mindful of that. Not only are the artists and those that are involved cool, but they show just so much insight and foresight. And as you're saying, Refilwe, I'm also not an artist. I love consuming, I love watching, I love listening, etc. Some of you may know about my passion for scenarios, and for us to be able to imagine futures which are beyond our reckoning, way into the horizon, it requires creative energies and creative minds. And I know that the subtext and some of the mentioning of the issue of how we respond to COVID, etc., is important. But an important thing that I'm hoping artists can help us do is imagine what a post-COVID world would look like, whether it's going to be an even worse dystopia or some kind of utopia that we could look forward to. I'm also in awe of how artists are able to look at the mound or material of history and the contemporary to produce works that serve as mirrors or as memories of the past, or what we in scenario planning like to call memories of the future. That's why artists can often be the prophets or prophetesses of their times. This also reminds me of a story that Salman Rushdie related about this artist in some small town who drags a huge rock into the town square. And there's a little kid who looks at this huge rock that's there, and he watches the sculptor working on it every day. And he comes and plays around him. And eventually he comes there this one morning and is amazed. And he asks the artist, how did you know there's a horse in there? And that's what I'm impressed by with artists, that they have this imagination. They're able to find the beauty or the tragedy in this kind of history that they highlight. but I'm hoping also that they can look at the way forward for us wherever we go. So this report, like any work of art, puts the spotlight on certain issues. This is about as good as it can get. As you know, this project is a tome. It's at 450 pages. It's one of MISTRA's longest reports, but each page, the few pages that I've managed to be able to read, has already been worth the read. And I have no doubt I'll be looking through most of it for a long time. So part of my duty is to say a vote of thanks. And one of that is for the veterans who started on this project almost a decade ago and who developed the early thinking. I'm thinking of Baba Patika Ntuli. I'm thinking of Professor Oliphant Andre. Some of you are present and some we couldn't make it. People like Leslie DeKenney, Errol Joffe, good to see you there. John Rowett, Faisal Mamdou, Judge Albie Sachs, thank you very much for your kindly reminders and for sticking with this project over all these years. And these are amongst the few people that were there right from the beginning and have stayed on course. Thanks also to the current editors and project leaders. You brought an energy to it to make sure that we went over the finish line. So well done, Innocentia and to Sandile, and really, really appreciate what you've done to deliver this baby of about 10 years old. To all the contributors, this would not have been possible without your sweat and your gray cells being applied to this. I think most of you know that one of MISTRA's unique selling proposition is that it's a platform for bringing different practitioners, intellectuals, academics, public sector, private sector. But I think for me, at today's webinar, today's discussion, just the spectrum of political thinking is incredible. On one hand, we have someone who is as concerned about the South African nation, and that's Gideon du Plessis from Solidarity Trade Union. And at the other end of the spectrum, we had Phoebe Purgita from the Tilly House. So thanks to you all. Thank you to all those that made this publication possible. Professor Susan Boyson, the Director of Research, Terry, the publications person at MISTRA, Heidi Brooks, I should say Dr. Heidi Brooks, Dr. Zenzo Moyo, and Jabula Zwane. Thanks very much for all the effort you did in pulling it together. I know how difficult this was, and it's really, really appreciated. Special thanks to Breeze Yoko. That cover, I think, is going to be the talk of the town for a long time to come. And your gracious agreeing to allow us to have it on our cover, have your artwork on our cover is really appreciated. Manda Langa, what can I say? It's always such a pleasure to listen to you. I wish we could have doubled the time just to increase everyone else's, but also your time to keep sharing your vast experience and your insights. And then thanks obviously to everyone that made the event a success. Annalile, Sipokazi, and Noma, pulling it all together, ensuring that everything worked well, and we're ending roughly on time as long as I cut my speech short now. And thanks to each one of you for your attendance. I have one last request, Annalile. Can I ask everybody to unmute and just give an applause for all the work that has gone in, for all of you that have made this a success. So unmute and on 3, clap. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I'm not going to say anything further except for thank you, Abba, and thank you, Noma. You can close off the meeting. This will be on our social media, so make sure you follow us. Thanks again, colleagues.
Thank you, facilitator. Well done.